So I just wanted to, I'm not doing the lecture introduction tonight. Natasha Sandmeyer is going to come to the podium in a minute to actually introduce Lara and Fredrik. But since they are our visiting faculty this quarter, I just wanted to give them a general welcome. It's so energizing and overall great to have you teaching one of our advanced topic studios. They've been teaching around the world, and the work is incredibly provocative and compelling. I imagine some of the people in the audience, both here or on Zoom, are their students right now. And I can't wait to hear the questions, but we all know their work, but it's actually the first time I'm going to see them lecture. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing about the work in their own words. So thank you so much for being at UCLA this quarter, and thank you for giving the lecture tonight. And now I'm going to ask Natasha to come over and introduce them.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone, and hi, everyone online. I don't know where the camera is, but welcome, and welcome so much to Lara and Fredrik. I'm so pleased to be introducing them tonight, and so pleased they are here with us in LA today. When I first met Lara, she was in her 4th year at the Architectural Association, designing a grand tour for a monumental sphere, an architecture that wandered across the world, collecting the regional stories and narratives that it searched for as it searched for its own identity, ultimately realizing that that identity really was the construction of public space. It was a civic infrastructure, a forum for interaction, and this might sound familiar. That same year, also at the AA, but in a different studio, Fredrik was designing a kimono through which he was already exploring the possibilities of media, in this case, textiles, to act as an intermediary between public space, between the politics of the individual, the citizen, and the world around it. Again, this might sound familiar, or it will soon. I think these two projects, the sphere and the kimono, set them down a path that honestly continued to, they continued to forge together in their kind of new world as Space Popular through that collaboration. And these two very early works, for me, are indicative of the trajectory that they were then about to embark on. From a kimono and a wandering sphere over the years, their work has followed this same path of the unexpected, the provocative, the experimental. And again, so pleased you are here with us today. Shortly after graduating, I think in 2012, the decades after 2020 is all kind of a blur. Shortly after graduating, Lara and Fredrik relocated to Bangkok, where they were instrumental in shaping the curriculum for a school called INDA, an architectural design program at Chulalongkorn University, which was then still relatively new, I think probably about 8 years old. And years later, by the time that they'd left, they'd mapped out the core curriculum and imprinted an attitude of experimentation, innovation, of course, color, onto and within the school. And they founded Space Popular while still in Bangkok, and quickly had work that allowed them to explore the spectrum of private and public space, from festival design to really beautiful spa interiors. After having made their indelible mark there, Space Popular returned to London, where they also launched Tools for Architecture, their academic teaching platform. And we are very fortunate that Lara and Fredrik are bringing that platform here to AUD. And I hope all of us will have the opportunity to see that work later this quarter. Their practice has flourished in recent years with a range of work from exhibitions at the 2018 Venice Biennale, a physical and virtual gate at Doksogung Palace in Seoul, an exhibition at the Royal Institute of British Architects in London, the Glass Chain also in London, to name a few, and a stunningly beautiful house in Valencia, with more projects on the way. As many of you know, if you are their students, in addition to their other design work and projects, the studio leans heavily into virtual reality as a mode of spatial exploration and community building. And they built the first architectural conference entirely held in VR in 2020, and have designed a number of extraordinary exhibitions that have both physical and virtual components. Their most recent work, which I hope we'll see today, is a written and visual manifesto for the future of virtual communication and experience, and something that's honestly more urgent now than ever. And that is a civic infrastructure for virtual teleportation, in which they use textiles to operate as portals of civic space, which for me is a really beautiful weaving together of a world of experiences that began with another kind of textile, the kimono, and another kind of civic space, the sphere. So I think also for you students who are attending, I hope you really pay attention to the work that you do today. It could very well inform your future practice in this kind of 10-year loop and beautiful cycle. So we are so fortunate that Lara and Fredrik are joining us here at AUD to share their world with us. Please join me in welcoming Space Popular.
Thank you so much.
Amazing.
You take that one?
Thank you. Wow. Thank you so much, Natasha. This was, well, by far the most incredible look into our work and our progression that anyone has ever done. I'm incredibly touched. And yeah,
we're not
maybe
used
you
to
begin
having
because I
this.
can't begin.
We're not used to having that amazing introductions, so there'll be some repetition probably when we begin. But thank you so much for both the introduction, Natasha, and for inviting us to be here. And we're super excited to be at UCLA and in LA and to work with our students. We're already well into the projects that very much relates to what we're going to be talking about today, which is focusing on the work of the studio over the past 6 years or so. So again, this is then a repeat a little bit of what Natasha already said. So the studio was formed in Bangkok in 2013, where, as she said, we were based because we were teaching very much full-time at that point at INDA, where we were both year coordinators over a 5-year period. And we have been teaching also at the AA for about five years. We left in 2021. And we're currently also teaching at Daniels at University of Toronto.
I feel like we always start with this intro that gives a bit of a sense of the scope of our of the type of work that we do. It also kind of feels like as an architect you always have to legitimize your work through built work, but we do very much enjoy working across the two realms or the two realities. So this has been the latest built work that we completed. It's the house that Natasha was mentioning in Valencia, Spain, that use quite an what we think is quite an interesting combination of construction systems. One of them being a traditional brick vaulting system, typical of that part of Spain, with a sort of very industrial kind of structural system. And this way of thinking about, well, the sort of systems to construct space spans across. I mean, it's something that we not only look at structurally, but also we think about systems to construct atmospheres. So you might be able to identify that in some of our works with interiors, where there is different elements or architectural features that are used throughout a space in order to create a sense of cohesion between the different parts of a project, but at the same time have a sense of variation. We have also been really lucky to be able to work at the scale of furniture, especially with our clients in Thailand, where we were designing every bit and every knob, every fixture in the space, and that has really imprinted on us, and that is something that is very much a part of also designing virtual spaces. So we see the kind of ways of designing experiences through furniture, through construction systems, through detailing, and then through virtual means as not too different from one another. It's all a means to an end, and that end usually being the delivering of a spatial experience. So in this case, we see another construction system where we're thinking through technically how to achieve something that at its best would create a sense of an atmosphere. So we see here, and jumping from that to absurdly large scales, like attempting to design 4,000 units in a whole, basically like creating a whole neighborhood of Stockholm. We were crazy enough to sign up for competitions that were far well beyond what maybe we would have been capable of executing, but we have always been interested in attempting to super high degrees of complexity while really trying to work out details, and again really trying to create spaces that through their character convey an atmosphere or set the stage for a particular type of or like particular feeling. While doing all of this, we basically like quite early on the first headset landed in our hands, and at the same time before that we had also been interested in thinking about the space of dreams or spaces that were unbuilt and that still could be experienced. So we have been working both on projects that were very much built and experienced on current available platforms and with currently available hardware, as well as envisioning or like creating visions for speculative futures presented through as well immersive media.
So with that introduction, giving a little bit of an overview over the kind of things that we do, we're going to be focusing this talk under this title, Portal Galleries, the Magic and Mechanics of Virtual Traveling, which is also the title of our upcoming show. And we think also that it kind of summarizes a lot of our general interests, both in physical and virtual reality, but of course largely focusing on the question of virtual space and virtual togetherness. And really at the core of this is we've started to realize with our upcoming show and with previous projects that the way that we can be inside a virtual space is important, but really the way that we can travel in between them, or the way that we enter them, is really, really important. And we think even that these virtual portals might become, we think, if the metaverse is growing as it is, becoming really one of the most important design challenges of our time. So we've explored this notion in a bunch of different projects. Some of them we'll talk about a bit more in detail today. In some cases, quite literally, as visions of what might happen in public space if we can in the future open up virtual portals where we can spatially interact with people that are not there physically. But also imagining and looking back through history and how media has served in one way or another as a virtual portal where interaction might be limited. We've also, in exhibitions that might be about something else, like in this exhibition called The Glass Chain, which is about German Expressionism 100 years ago, but really then building up a sculpture that forms kind of as a portal, both directly and metaphorically. And we've also explored this notion, as I said, kind of very directly, imagining literal doors, literal places that we pass through, but also how architecture itself can start to mutate into new forms that are in their very nature doors. Like in this film that we'll talk a bit more later, which is commissioned by Maxi in Rome.
And sometimes very directly, like we are going to expand a little bit on this notion now, explaining this project, the Gate of Bright Lights, in Seoul, South Korea, in 2019. This was a really important project for us. We still cannot believe that we were allowed to do something on this spectacular heritage site, which is also one of our absolute favorite styles of decorative styles in architecture, the Dancheong style. So the Gate of Bright Lights, actually, Gate of Bright Lights is the name of this gateway, is what we've been told says up there on that banner, and this was the original site for a gateway. So we were trying to reflect upon this notion of what gates meant in the past and what they might mean now. To put it, I mean, to just give you an overview, the installation or the project was a video piece that was presented on an LED screen that fitted in one of the openings of that gateway where there would have been previously a door. So super directly creating now a virtual door. And here you see two views of what that would have, that looked like as it was installed. And we did something that we do very often, which is try to do a quick retrospective of gates or of doors, but in this case we were looking at gateways to media space. And I guess maybe by looking at them now, you start to recognize a remote and then some sort of access to a TV studio through the TV no signal image, and then some kind of Windows medieval door, and so on. So we started just as an exercise to start thinking about what would doors look like if we had actual doors into these media spaces. And as I was mentioning before, doing that on an existing door, which back in the day would have had a lot of meaning, not only embedded in its ornamentation, but literally like was what allowed you or not allowed you or kept you outside of it. And I mean, this is why we see the evolution of doors being these sort of devices that at the same time are stopping you from getting into a place, but at the same time are also telling you the story of what is behind that door. In the 21st century, this problem is quite different because we access spaces in hybrid forms. Doors don't have the same presence, and often you can access a space or you can access an institution through means that are not necessarily just physical. So more and more media is becoming the destination for human interaction, and therefore the consideration of what a gate is, and especially with media becoming increasingly spatial, we think the consideration of the gateway might come back to maybe something not so far from what it was in the past, but that at the same time is using the means of access that media has enabled.
And at the same time as we're thinking a lot about how we access virtual spaces, we have been doing a lot of research, both with students and in relationship to exhibition projects, about what these virtual places are actually like, what's actually possible in them, how they're built, and what they stand for also in many cases. And many of you will probably now be kind of familiar with many of these spaces. Let's say 5 or 6 years ago, when many of these started popping up, there were many of them very empty. We should just mention here that, which we'll talk a little bit later in relationship to the project that Natasha brought up on Civic Teleportation, we choose to work mainly with this platform, mainly because it's the only one that exists that is based on a non-profit basis, and that has literally a manifesto for a healthy internet at its core. Because we really think that if we do this in the wrong way, and essentially the way we're using these platforms is essentially like voting for the future that we want. And if we use the one that's on the far right, perhaps we get a future that we might not want. But as we've been talking about, a lot of the research we've been doing points to the fact of what it's like to be inside of these places when you're wearing a headset or not. But one of the bigger problems, and that we're really increasingly interested in, what is it like to move in between them? And by and large, there's no way of doing this now. And we really rely, I think, in the future on the fact that we will be able to pass between space to space. At the moment, this is the kind of design intention that gets put into this. Essentially, this is looking in VR, the way that you access not only from platform to platform, but between world and world within the same platform. Basically proving, we think, the lack of design and the lack of design criteria for what it's like to move between these different spaces. And also to just give a little bit of an overview, we think it's important to kind of, this is a list put together by Ryan Schultz that gets updated on a weekly basis of all of the different, what we would call today, metaverse spaces that exist today. Some of them are not live yet or have recently been closed down. But what this basically proves is also the scale of the complexity, because essentially what will be needed really now is this, for these spaces to be able to be connected and not exist in their own silo with their own rules, their own laws, etc., etc. And the problem gets bigger and more complex when you realize that each individual one of those looks more or less like this, or even more complex in many cases. It's already a kind of design conundrum that is extremely challenging to deal with. Some of them have persistent maps, such as Decentraland and other places, where you can actually move between them. But then from moving from one of these to another, it's extremely challenging. There are, apart from us, quite a lot of people out there in the world, though, that are working on this problem, but not from a design point of view or an architecture point of view. This group, Open Metaverse Interoperability Group, is a group that we're a part of, which is mainly put together by developers that are working on code that would make this possible. There's a lot of things in the works, and slowly collaboration between platforms. There is already also quite a lot of design being put into this, but from a perspective that, at least as architects or as architectural designers, is quite foreign to us. And that's partially what we're trying to work on with students, figuring out a way to imagine what one of these portals are like, or what is it like to walk from one space to another, even to be within one of these spaces. And for anyone who's curious, in relationship to all this, and in 2020 we put together this, 2021, this report, which you can reach through distantcrowds.report, where we tried with students to put together a sort of kind of comprehensive understanding of sort of some of these issues and what might happen in the future. And we have tried in different projects that we've done over the years to create visions of what these bridges might be like, but also what it might be like to be simply in one of these spaces and have a gathering in there. And we'll talk about a few of these virtual projects that we've put out in the world.
Yes, so I mean, as Fredrik was saying, we keep moving between talking about the infrastructure in between worlds and the design of worlds themselves. Is almost like continuing to move in or constantly moving between designing buildings and designing city, right? And we feel like it's relatively easy maybe to jump into the design of spaces. It's super hard to try and understand what is the virtual city or what is the virtual street, what is the virtual in-between. But staying a little bit within the design of spaces, we often go back to this project from 2013 where we had never even tried a headset or anything like that. And we created this proposal called the Cloud of Resilience, which was, let's say, our first attempt to a virtual space, and also a virtual space that was also a space of information. The Cloud of Resilience is a database of global mortality rates, where each of the nodes in a diagram that you could see on a website represents a deceased person in a particular point in time. The sphere grows out, in that way representing time, and this enables you to start seeing things. I mean, we had pandemics in there. Little did we know that this was going to become so a part of our lives. And then each of those points was a gateway to a space. It was a point in time that represented the moment of your departure. But at the same time, that point became a point of remembrance. Let's say as what we call very weirdly a thanatosphere, but a space, let's say, that was personal to you, and where people could come and leave objects and so on. Why we keep coming back of this is because this project is at the same time trying to be, or like enabling the design of virtual spaces to be together in, at the same time as it's trying to do the outside, or is trying to do the street, or trying to create the portal. And often we think about this portal, or like this outside, as a space of information, or the outside being a map or a diagram where we orient ourselves before stepping in. And then moving on to, let's say, one of the more recent virtual space commissions, we just wanted to talk a little bit about how we approach this from the point of view of a space that had to be actually built and working and being operative for people to actually hold a conference in, which is this space that we created in 2020 for Punto de Inflexión, which is an architectural conference created by the Arquia Foundation in Spain, which every year usually looks like this. It's an incredibly important event because it enables a whole generation of young architects to basically establish ties among each other. So the socializing is a really important part of it. They do it in a different part of the Iberian Peninsula every year, sometimes in Spain or Portugal. And that year they had it planned for Barcelona. we feel we were very lucky because then you get an excuse to use the amazing Barcelona city plan that is based on this grid. I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And that enabled us to think about this possibility of like a non-Euclidean space, or basically an impossible space that gave the sense of being endless while we were actually only creating 9 spaces. So a lot of the experience of this space was the hopping in between rooms being each of them one of these city blocks. And the logic in which you move through made it sort of feel like you were moving across an endless city, which is a little bit maybe what Barcelona sometimes feels like. But as a gateway to this, in very practical terms, we soon realized that we had to build just a website to prepare people for where they were going to enter. And the website once more became the map, what before we were talking about as the diagram. In this case, the website became the floor plan of these 9 blocks. And therefore you were aware of where you were entering. You would enter one of these rooms, and as you were navigating through in the doors on the corners, you would be linked kind of seamlessly with a little bit of waiting time onto the next one. What's interesting perhaps also about this project is that we really had to design it as a virtual space that was going to be experienced through the screen. So the spaces were designed really with that in mind. I think it's going to be a project that is going to be kind of a vision of nostalgia for us for the rest of our lives, because it's kind of hilarious to see this, like, part of the architecture is literally like 1920 by 1080 format, so that it eventually gives you this kind of full screen, because it felt completely absurd to always be looking at shared images when most of the material that you were looking at in these exhibition spaces was actually 2D material. And it really made us think about, like, what is the reason for building a 3-dimensional space when actually we are experiencing it all, or like we are trying to so hard to optimize it for a 2D screen. But it gave us this, or like it made us understand the possibility of, like, well, you are maybe going through the central path where you are really just looking at information, having more of an individual experience, and then eventually you would bump into somebody and you would have these sort of weird gardens on the sides that were these triangular spaces where then you could go together and explore and chat and just be there. And that really helped us start to understand how does one, or like, what do you ask of virtual rooms when all they are doing is basically setting the background for different kinds of encounters, different types of gatherings that you might not necessarily know what they are going to be exactly in detail, no? How do you create just basically an atmosphere that feels nice? So we designed all sorts of rooms. This is a projection room, but you see that, like, I mean, basically to create a room with a screen could have been a lot simpler than this. But then the whole language of these rooms, the way they are, the lighting and everything is thought of to basically create a context for these things to happening, and with the only aim of creating basically a spatially interesting and just comfortable and pleasing context for that to happen within. Often we also create more spaces where circulation was quite playful and you could get a sense of discovery by working through a more labyrinthic space. And then there was the main space, which was literally very much like a cinema. Interestingly, the style of the buildings around this block is all inspired and mimicking quite a bit buildings from the Gothic quarters of Barcelona, which is not where this city grid is. It's the medieval side of the city. And that became quite an interesting thought of this, like, well, you can enter one of the city blocks, but you're actually accessing a completely different neighborhood of the city. We had the also very weird task of designing what people would look like in these spaces, which is something that it was really fun to do. At the same time, ideologically, I cannot wait to not have to do that ever again, because it's like designing uniforms for people. But there is something that becomes quite interesting with regards to well, just optimization, and if someone comes with a very heavy and really amazing avatar, it will make the experience for everybody else a little bit worse. It's quite an interesting paradox, and we're still trying to figure out what this actually means. But it also allowed us to understand the meaning of body language. We don't have it here, but we have some hilarious videos of how sassy you can be with these very simple avatars that are just planes. And also how much it means to maybe just like move a little bit to signal that you're talking when you're talking. And also just to face people. Like the little bit of body language that this could have really created a lot of warmth around the otherwise perhaps very removed social interactions that you would have had in virtual space.
And what Lara was talking about, this notion of this kind of hybrid life we're having now, even if part of what we literally do is wear headsets and talk and interact with people in virtual space, we're still mainly in a 2D world still. And what we really believe, and it's at the kind of core of all of our work we're doing, especially the speculative work, is that by the middle of the 21st century, all media will be spatial. So we will all live through a time when we don't have smartphones anymore, no more laptops or monitors. We probably will not even see any billboards on buildings or screens anymore, but it will all be through media that we wear all the time. And considering this, a lot of our work, in fact, almost all the exhibitions we've done include different forms of spatial media that is worn by visitors, and always, as you see here, Lara, in the bottom left corner, interacting with one of the sculptures. It's always matched to the environment where the body is in, so that the physical environment can be interacted with both physically and virtually. And then what you're experiencing inside is what we refer to as spatial essays. They're essentially films, but they're spatial films that then aids the rest of the experience that you're having physically in the gallery. And we'll talk a bit about some of these projects that relates to togetherness in virtual spaces, such as this project, the Venn Room, which we showed the first time at the Tallinn Architecture Biennale, which looks at virtual togetherness in the home in the age of spatial media. So basically looking both back at what previous media has done to the home and how it changed not just the way we rearrange furniture, but how families are structured, etc. And then, of course, what has been happening to all of us, of course, with a technology that's not new, but has again changed the way we relate to the home. But in the age of spatial media, this will change once again, and probably very, very, very radically this time. And basically, when you are in a virtual environment using spatial media, either through AR or VR, your home where your body is in and your virtual home and the people that you're interacting with will start to overlap. And this is what we call a Venn room. Essentially, we see these two floor plans of two different people's apartments that at some point will overlap, where if I sit down on my chair, you might sit down on your sofa, and we want to sit next to each other. The virtual environment will need to accommodate for that. And we did this speculative project where we imagine all these sort of weird, possibly beautiful, strange moments that might happen. And these sort of moments when we have someone's cabinet intersecting with someone's kitchen, or when two different doors overlap. And we start to speculate both on what we might want to do with our homes. We are speculating that we could probably see in the near future companies building apartments that are compatible with other apartments. If I live in Hong Kong and you live in Frankfurt, we buy the same apartment so we can live in an overlapped apartment that matches perfectly if we want to have a long-distance relationship or whatever it might happen to be. But we always speculated also on the fact that probably these overlaps might start to become meaningful, and we might want to decorate them. Like if we have a strange overlap that we share over many, many years, we might start to invent a new way of kind of demarcating that. And also speculating, of course, what happens not just with me and your home, but all of our homes together start to be overlapped, and kind of echoing Marsh McLuhan, thinking about the possibility of a global home.
So this was a project that was at the same time, looking at a sort of layout issue of how you overlap things, and also not of a problem, but possibly an issue of aesthetics and style, which is something that also fascinates us. How do form in architecture, how do detailing, how do motifs and ornamentation start to build up spaces of meaning. And we were lucky enough also to work on this research project that was precisely dealing with our interest in style. And we, over the course of a couple of years, we developed research where we were trying to see the overlap or the relationships in between the development of styles in architecture and the developments in media. This manifested on an exhibition at the RIBA in London, that's the Royal Institute of British Architects. That is another aspect that we're going to talk about, of how, like, when you're working with eventually an enormous database, which is what we're doing for this project, you end up having to communicate that through spatial means. So again, how do we create gateways to ideas and stories through a diagram, where in this case the room is a sort of really large diagram. So as I was saying before, this project looks at the relationship between innovation in media and style, particularly in British architecture, because we were working with the RIBA archive, covering an insane span of time from the 16th century to the 21st century. There is a reason why we chose to work with such a large span of time. The reason to begin in the 16th century is that we were working, or like we were taking off from Sebastiano Serlio's book on style, which we argue is the first mass media device in architecture. There were architecture books before Serlio's books, but he was the first one to, first of all, write in Italian, which was the language of the people, as opposed to writing in Latin, which was only spoken at that time only by the upper classes. And at the same time, it included a lot of illustrations, believe it or not, but architecture books before this were only text. So what this meant is that suddenly this became a book that a lot more people could access. You perhaps didn't even need to be able to read because there was so many illustrations of architecture. And it also meant that before the printing press, and Mario Carpo puts it very well in this quote, if in order to see a building, you had to travel to see it, because books were really rare. So buildings could not travel, so people had to. The printing press makes it possible for the book to be more widely available, and the book becomes a vehicle for the building to travel within. This is something that we keep thinking about, and we'll come back later to with another project, but this idea of basically compressing space into devices that allow it to travel much greater distances that maybe bricks and mortar do. And in order just to give a little bit of a sense of what a project like this entails, like we figure out different categories that we want to look at, as you see here, and eventually there is just like an insane amount of spreadsheet work that we do in order to start to be able to compare and see patterns when things are happening across a very large timeline. And with that, it becomes possible to us to see or to identify some of these relationships in between the developments in architectural style and mass media. Here you see what the exhibition eventually looked like. As I said, this room turns into a diagram. There is a really large model, a printed carpet that is a sort of map of this timeline, and there is also there is one immersive film in 4 acts.
So just to take you through a little bit of what this diagram, how it operates. So again, there is this large digitally printed carpet, which acts as a datum line that gives a sense of time, running diagonally across the space, where every 2 centimeter indicates 1 year, which then kind of helps as a kind of navigating guide for visitors. And this then basically everything that's in the room, collection objects in the model, etc., everything kind of follows that. Then also the carpet indicates different shifts in style. Of course, it's not this simple, but the styles overlap. But part of the hypothesis shows itself here with the speeding up of style that links to the development of mass media. So then all of the ornaments in the carpets themselves are the mass media objects and devices that were invented during that time. Zooming in, we see here there's towards the end of the timeline where we see things like video game devices, VR, etc. But then in the other end, we also see kind of the devices that were necessary in order to run a printing press. So then this film that we produced is the longest one we've ever done so far. It's 25 minutes, split over four acts or 4 different headsets. And this is sort of what, if you stand here, you would watch Act 2, and this is what you would see. So you see that the model is still there. It's always kind of linking you physically, so you can reach out and touch it. But then what you're actually seeing could be something completely different. So these 4 acts, they're split in the room like this, covering the area and the timeline that they cover. So the first act covers the 15th to the 16th century, where you're introduced to Serlio's book. So here, literally, the book appears on the model. We also have a tiny little virtual guide there. This is something that we kind of become accustomed to work with, which is incredibly effective, we find, in telling a story. Usually one of us does the motion capture and the other one does the voice. In this case, we brought in voice actors, but and then throughout this film, we're introduced to key moments in British architectural history when mass media was really important, such as in the work of Christopher Wren, who built St. Paul's Cathedral in London. He built over 50 churches in central London after the Great Fire. Almost all of them is in the Baroque style, completely copying the style that you could not find in England. And in the research, we found that he only left Britain once, which meant that he never saw any of these buildings that were inspired by, but he owned a gigantic library and constantly commissioned books to be sent to him. So he was a mass media-driven architect of the time. Act 2 covers the, covers the 19th century, where we start to see more and more books being translated in English. We're also introduced to mass media devices such as the camera and the first kind of devices that could bring us into spaces, the kind of first VR devices such as the stereoscope. And the third act covers the 20th century, when we start to see the development and introduction of cinema and then television, where of course we start to see real spaces inside the television, like television studios, that starts informing back on our homes, etc. We also start to see the first media devices that we can actually interact with in video games, that then slowly start to inform not just physical space, but new styles within the virtual space itself, within media. And then the 4th act, the most complex one, covers our century, where we start to kind of try to see some of the most important earliest moments, such as Pinterest, which we actually think, and related tools, which are in some cases kind of taboo to use for creative people, but we think it's one of the most important mass media devices of our time, leading eventually to what we talked about earlier, a world of complete spatial media, where basically all media exist in one way or another spatially around us. But having said that, of course, as Lara was mentioning before, we're really interested in how media has to be compressed in order to travel a certain distance, and that still remains. So we see here the tempietto growing out of Serlio's book, where we can see that spatial version and a compressed version, and this is something that we have explored in other projects, leaving freestyle behind, in our most recent film, Camera Balla, which looks actually at the work of Italian futurist Giacomo Balla from this perspective of compression of media history. So in this film, we're introduced to a kind of summarized, very simplified history, bringing us eventually to the spherical camera, 360 camera, which we think, we mentioned this earlier, is one of perhaps the most interesting tools in this effort of compressing information and being able to transport it at far distances. And especially interesting because the way that you want to experience this compressed version is actually spatially. So throughout this film, which was shown at Maxi in Rome, we're introduced to a series of rooms that we can experience as actual rooms, but what they actually are 360 flattened images. So they exist as 2D images, but they can be experienced spatially. And this is kind of a project we're looking for a new outlet for, because we're extremely excited about this possibility of thinking about flattened architecture that's experienced in a 3-dimensional way.
And there is always a precedent, right? So there has been flattened architecture for centuries. We have seen incredible frescoes in buildings that bring you to spaces that are just existing in like a micron of paint and egg yolk and ink and whatever. And we have seen also flat spaces in portable devices, such as a tapestry that you could also bring with you and deploy elsewhere. So we find it incredibly useful to think that you are never doing a new thing. You're just maybe, hopefully, following a progression of something, or maybe a regression, or whatever that is. But for some reason, we're incredibly attracted, for many reasons, we're very attracted to working with textiles, and this is one of them. The fact that they are these portable surfaces that in themselves can contain so much, and one of the things that they can contain is virtual worlds. So again, another one of these, like, what can we really do a project here? We were allowed to work in the tapestry room of the Royal Palace in Milan. And the tapestries in that room, they all share a theme, which is the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece. This story has traveled in tapestries of all kinds. It has traveled in illustrations, in vases, for centuries. So the project it's really like trying to continue this tradition and creating a new device or a new support for the same story. This weirdly shaped sculpture that you see there in the center is basically a picture, or is containing a picture of a virtual world that would be the augmented version of the very room in which the object sits. Imagine that that capsule is a mirrored object that is reflecting the room around it, but is reflecting a copy of this physical room that has these virtual characters within. That's the weird thing you're looking at. So here's the virtual room. Looks obviously as similar as possible to the physical one. And when you enter that virtual room through two headsets that are in the room, you are taken through a series of arguments by, again, this guide who is telling you about the differences in between having a physical body or not having it, and trying to take you through the ideas of what is the space that you are inhabiting at that moment inside a headset. Here you see more views of it. From the outside is a mirrored object. From the inside is a transparent object. So if you stand in the center, you have this sort of trompe-l'oeil view where you kind of see through the object. And yeah, as you are seeing here, this sense of the mirrored surface, which is not a mirror at all, is a print so this was interesting, geometrically really interesting to figure out how you create a reflection that works, or like that provides that illusion from every angle in an object with a quite complex geometry. So these are the Argonauts that we created that are characters in the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece, and that then you gather with in the virtual space in which you come into, and the guide basically taking you through it. But just going back to textiles, we have worked with fabrics. We also, you would notice that we work a lot with digitally printed carpets, like we were showing in freestyle. Fredrik was explaining how that carpet is a diagram. This is another carpet diagram. So we keep using these elements over and over to try and really learn what they can do. This is for an exhibition in Stockholm, at Arctes, the Architecture and Design Museum of Stockholm, which is again using the whole footprint of the gallery and turning it into a diagram. This was an enormous carpet, as you see here, with figures for scale. And it was accompanied by these fabric hangings, which were, again, some kind of tapestries that were showing in their prints a virtual world that eventually you were given access to. We enjoy, to an extreme degree, how much fabrics do by being just such a simple, light material to work with that is also installed in a few seconds. No? So suddenly you go from a white gallery to a space that is full of, or like that is taking you through all these environments through literally less than a millimeter thickness. Interestingly, this installation, what was holding that was scaffolding, which is what you use to construct solid buildings. So they were holding the virtual buildings, like the virtual spaces in this case. And here is yet a bunch of other projects where we worked as well with printed fabrics, and we continue to do, up until this moment where we started also working with virtual fabrics. So Threaded Thresholds, as Natasha was anticipating before, is our latest manifesto, and is a proposal for the fabric for civic teleportation. This comes from, in parallel also with our current research on portals, and as beginning to think what is a door or what is a gateway that is inviting enough, and at the same time it cognitively allows you to understand that there is a threshold, that you're going through something, but it's not closing the space, it's actually inviting you to go through. So we find it useful to create manifestos. We know it's risky because you put something in writing kind of very decidedly. I did a few years, well, whatever. You all know what I mean. But we're still brave and go out there with writing manifestos. And well, you can actually access all the points in this manifesto for how we think a threaded portal infrastructure should be created. To put it very briefly, we think that Fabric is not only an inviting form of creating a portal, but at the same time, Fabric can in itself contain code, right, in its weave. So we think all of that can be very useful analogs or very useful metaphors to carry with us when we try and create a system to travel through virtual spaces. Here you see a few of the images that we created to illustrate this that are very simply just like curtains that are slightly pulled up. Here you see that the fabric is a sort of a quilt, and again, like trying to give this sense that there could be code readable between them. So what we were seeing before in some of the slides that we were showing of how it happens today, where you get all these warnings and all this stuff, perhaps some of these things could be embroidered in that fabric and could be communicated to you in a more holistic way. And of course, we had to heavily reference Magritte and his incredible visions of virtual curtains that have been amazing to look at and discover.
So we both imagine these virtual fabrics to be both literally, like it's both a metaphor, but actually we really propose it to really one day work like that. And this kind of relates to our latest project, which is what we will close with today, which is an exhibition which will hopefully open at the Sir John Soane Museum in London in June. It's been postponed for 2 years, and we're already working on it for 2 years almost when it got postponed. Long anticipated for us, certainly, which is on portals specifically, and that's where the title of the talk comes from, Portal Galleries. For those of you who don't know, the Soane Museum and the work of Sir John Soane and his collaborator Joseph Gandy really was a person that was imagining the sort of traveling through virtual portals, mainly through paintings and objects and other things. This is a sort of imagined version of a room at the Soane Museum. It doesn't look exactly like that, but it looks exactly like this, one of the rooms, where you have all of these paintings that are windows into other worlds, and those are put on walls that are also windows into other worlds. It is kind of endless loop of portals and windows into kind of what we call then virtual spaces. A virtual space doesn't need to be digital to be virtual. And really, similar to freestyle, we really think that in order to really maybe hopefully get somewhere with what a virtual portal might be like in the future, we really need to look back. And in this case, we think that the best place to look back is to look at portals in fiction. So this project is a research project which is looking at basically the entire history, very ambitious, of virtual portals in books, in TV, in films, in games, etc. We're leaving out religion and folklore to a different project. But similarly to the previous project, this is what the database looks like at the moment. It goes down very, very far and includes a lot of details. And we are, at the moment, actually quite overwhelmed with trying to finish this even with all this delay. But just to give you a little bit of sense of how we deal with this, so these are some of the different categories. Of course, we have the names of the portal, the stories they belong to, Are they portals or are they teleportation? Genre, different audiences, who created them and when? Had they been portrayed in different media, such as Alice in Wonderland, which is seen in books and TV series and games, etc. And then what are the characteristics of the portal? And how do you create them? And how are they used? So like, do you need a key? Do you need training? Can it open many times? Do you pass through it voluntarily? And how does it serve the narrative? And we're already beginning to get some really interesting data. We can see kind of in the left here that at least in our database, the majority of portals are dealing with portals between space. Some of them will be dealing with space and time, some only time, and some realities or dimensions, etc. And we're starting to tease out some really critical kind of readings that we're not quite ready with yet, but we'll just share with you that at least now during, let's say, the past 30 years or so, a lot of the portals are increasingly about magic and increasingly about exclusivity and about shutting people out, which is actually something, a lot of our favorite portals, it turns out to be that they really serve a narrative that is highly problematic. In many cases, you cannot even learn how to use the portal. You need to be born into a certain group of people to be able to pass through them. And in often cases, that might be like an orphan, someone who has lived a difficult life. But it turns out that that person is actually a chosen one and belongs to an elite class of people who can travel through a different universe. We also see a lot of examples where portals are used as a device to emphasize someone's power over other people. But in also many other cases, it's really about wonder and about beauty and about imagining new and strange possibilities. And overall, we're extremely excited about what this project might show. And just a quick overview of how we're trying to kind of visualize a diagrammatic system to categorize them. Early sketches here, very, very complex. Hope that you get to see it. And here's an overview over kind of some of the portals that will be featured. Probably many of them you recognize. And also then just to close, this is not really intentional, but our logo type, which we designed really before we had any work at all, is itself a portal, which someone else pointed out to us not so long ago. And with that, thank you so much for inviting us to lecture and for teaching the studio here. We're very grateful. Thank you.
Watch out. Who wants it? Thank you.
Get us started. No, just to get us started, thank you so much for this incredible talk. I want to go through all of those portals. I was trying to figure out how many of the references I could recognize and pick up on. And I love that you have things that, that come from very obscure culture and things that are, children's kind of widely spread things. So I was trying to find connections between the projects, the kinds of things that emerge after a lot of work has been put out there, either consciously or not consciously. And I think, Lara, you said in a couple different ways, at some point you asked, what do you ask for of virtual rooms, on where you were talking about the avatars, when you talked about designing the first avatars, which I thought it was hilarious that they were made of brick, but they could move like people. It was amazing. But I was thinking about what things look like in all of your projects. And in that sense, a type of device that uses culture, sometimes whole culture, as a means to invoke things that are known. And it's almost the reliance on the question of memory. But then in the way that gets deployed, basically what I wrote was like memory versus memorabilia. And memory as kind of collective constructs, things that exist in history, things that you can access, whether it's a lived experience or not. And memorabilia as a project of accumulation. And there's something in your projects, I think, that starts maybe with a database. And at that point, it transcends the reference. It becomes its own thing, its own device, its own animal. And I was thinking, going back to what things look like, that one of the questions that I always come up against is like, why, when we're inhabiting worlds that are completely virtual, that in a sense could be anything and everything, we construct them like the things we happen to know in the physical world. And it operates a little bit as an act of collecting, right? Like if you go to Decentraland and you look at the most images of the metaverse, it's just like, you know, a cartoon version of things that are known. So again, memory and accumulation. So it's not really a question, but I was curious about what are your thoughts on not only how you use your reference in your own work, but this sort of reliance or attachment that we have to, you know, the brick and the fabric of life that is familiar to us and that we were able to experience physically in order perhaps to engage with the virtual world. So, any thoughts?
Yeah. No, I mean, this is like 95% of the conversations that we have with our students, I think, are along the issues of the reference. And what's really interesting about building virtual spaces is that you are confronted with not having a problem to solve or not having a default context to reflect upon. No, there's no site per se. Like all the techniques that you might have experienced when having a brief for a physical site are not really there anymore, or maybe you don't have a quirky client that gives you all these ingredients to design for and so on. So we were first drawn into designing virtual spaces basically because they reflected this kind of greatest struggle of design, which is not having a problem to solve. And that's why actually we started to bring it into teaching, because we realized when we started practicing that, like, wait, the briefs for real, the briefs for actual projects when you're practicing are by far not as interesting as the one you get in school, right? So you start building your own context and stuff, and we're like, how can you prepare people for this? And at the same time, conveniently, we can also work in virtual realms, which we're really interested in. And the virtual worlds really confront you with that question, because architecture is not even providing shelter, right? So it makes you start thinking of all the other things that architecture is doing that we don't really have a vocabulary or a way to talk about, no? Which is about setting atmosphere and also sort of reinforcing social codes that you have learned and that are somehow imprinted in the repetition of spaces that you see and that you do certain things in over and over again, and you start creating those associations, right? So we soon realized that there is no escaping the reference in the creation of virtual worlds, because even if you try to do something new, then it's like, new in relationship to what? In relationship to the old. So either you're repeating them or you're negating them. And we think that speaking a language that can be read to a certain extent will lead to an experience that will be a lot richer than that which you could have if you try and remove or you try and create a new language that then needs to be taught or needs to be learned upon entering that space, right? So we feel like the use of references and certain little twists just basically brings into the visitor the possibility to autocomplete a lot, and that autocomplete makes that experience mean so much, or it makes it so much richer to the person on the other end. No? So I mean, we talk about this endlessly with the students. I think it's like the biggest part of the design of these spaces, and we try and use references very directly, but we basically think there is no escaping it. So we might as well use it very, very consciously and very intentionally as well. I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Oh, that's sweet of you. Thank you. So I'm in the studio of Lara and Fredrik right now, so I'm very familiar with all of those conversations at this point. I think when talking about references, it's interesting to ask what the choice of reference is. Your aesthetic demeanor is quite ornamental, let's say, and so it begs to question whether, and I've understood that now because it basically gives a point of reference when you are in the virtual space that is more recognizable, let's say, and then you understand where you are more based on these iconic iconographies. Does that say anything but then if we were to do the opposite, does minimalism or brutalism work in the virtual space in that aspect? Like which references can we use and not use, basically, or is that just your choice?
I mean, it's a great question. It would work if you're an architect. But most people don't really know what any of those things mean, right? If you don't happen to be an architect. So that's the language of the way that an architect sees the world. And if that's who you're building for, that might be a useful language to use. But I mean, as in our name, we are much more interested in the big languages that people share. So generally, like, virtual spaces are, to borrow the quote from Terence McKenna, the world is made of language. There's not a single thing in there that is not something you design to put in there. There's even, is there a sky? Do you have a body? All these things are up for grabs. So if you build a word out of language, then we think that then it's really important to build it so that as many people as possible can speak that language. And if it's built on the relationship between brutalism and not brutalism, then it's targeted to a very small group of people, I would imagine.
Could you say that about the real world too?
No, not necessarily, because then everything that's around whatever the thing is not part of someone's decision around how to speak to. If you plonk a building in one place, it's surrounded by a million other things that are not in your control, or not, which is why also we think that if you put a physical thing in the world, it should relate to what's around it. But also, of course, the part of it that are put there to speak in some way or another, also we think generally need to be or should be considered, and not just to speak a language that somehow you inherited from a previous generation. That's often the case.
I mean, there is a thing here that is also whether, if you're talking about brutalism as an aesthetic style, then yes, no, because there is probably a lot of associations built upon what brutalist architecture would look like. So if you build a space that is concrete and so on, and you really speak that language in that virtual world, there will be associations made to that. But the two ones you mentioned, of brutalism and minimalism, we're trying to not be at their core purely aesthetic styles, even if they were at the core of the ideology was not visual, no, or like it was not an aesthetic one. So even if it could be read as such, so there is a conflict there in what they were trying to be at their core and how we interpret them as aesthetic devices or aesthetic experiences, which I think then is different.
Thank you so much. I mean, incredible work. I love it. It's hard for me to, I don't have a critique because I just adore everything you do. I think it's fantastic. I love the idea that, the way I see it is you're taking archive, heavy research that is, for a younger generation, almost impossible, for most people, impossible to go through. And you're turning it into an interactive space where you can go in and learn and have all that knowledge or those references, and it's basically a virtual museum of the archive or whatever, whatever archive in each project. The Venn room is also fascinating because that's what the metaverse is, right? It's a spatial web. This is where things statistically are going. So there's so much there. But I'm curious about which archive, which is the next thing you want to do? Because I know you're working on portals and hopefully opening the exhibition soon. But I'm wondering what kind of archive in relationship to your work or in relationship to virtual spaces, what do you think would be your dream project? It's a tough question, but.
We probably have different ideas.
Yeah, so you go.
Yeah. I have this thing in my head for a little while ago that is around controllers, around things that you hold in your hand, no, and you operate with, and how every time we see someone wearing an AR device, they are like just flicking the air super awkwardly, and I'm starting to think of like how much we will need things to hold in our hands, where we start to build that relationship in between whatever we are interacting with or controlling and the tactile experience of that. So we've started to think a little bit and to write a bit about weird things, like what is this? No, that this, like, we were also looking at the audio guide devices in museums, and of course like game controllers and all these things that have been created to interact with media and are just like, how did we end up with this? But it also provides a lot of I don't know, in cognitively comfortable interactions with something that is not physical. No, so that is, we're also thinking about this notion or this term that we were calling the haptic revival, that seems to have come with the internet, and then architecture starts really focusing on materials or like exposing the materiality of construction materials at the same time as you are getting this photography and so. Well, anyway, sorry, there's like rambling around a little bit, but basically there's like things that we touch in order to access media, and haptics is one thing that I would love to get deeper into. So building that archive would probably be my choice, but
no, not related to kind of things to look at, but more in the things we really, really enjoy doing with the media we work with, like this, like freestyle, this big model, and then a spatial media interaction where you are in both worlds at the same time. I mean, ideally, and we do not know if it will ever happen, but it's possible that it will in a big, really big way generally for this coming industry of spatial media, to make those models into actual buildings, like in an actual real life scale building, which is meant to be experienced as a story, where you're wearing spatial media, and everything you touch, everything you interact with has an infinite depth. So like in a virtual environment or with anything virtual, like anything has the capacity to be smart, so to speak. Like this bottle cap can be the key to an infinite amount of experiences. And if you imagine an entire house, an entire building, where everything has the capacity that you can experience simultaneously while being there and remotely, and that's like just media-wise something we really hope we'll be able to get to one day.
I also don't know if I have a question per se, but it's more of kind of a fascination, but that's a good kind of pivot point. It's fascinating, the kind of resurgence of history in your work, going all the way back, and that you so clearly situate yourself in a particular place. I mean, I find that really impressive. And then you briefly go back and you touched on the Baroque, and I'm looking at, based on your last comment just now also, there seems to be kind of a reverence for flatness, right? And that's also, I think, a Baroque feature. The idea that we're able to experience really complex three-dimensional space, but as a vehicle for telling a story, as you say, very directly with a very specific intention. And I'm kind of wonder, and again, I don't know if it's a question or not per se, but is it a clever attempt at completing your research and producing that physical space of that, because ultimately that will be the shortcut in architecture to produce? Or is it because it has the capacity, that kind of idea of flatness, or that has the capacity to deliver that kind of, let's say, that space of decoration and ornament that also has the capacity to tell another architectural story? Does that make sense? Am I?
Yeah, actually, I always think back at one thing that one of the early lectures we gave in London, it was a panel, several people was giving lectures, and one of the other architects lecturing was David Kohn. We were so kind of starstruck by lecturing with him. And I didn't expect it at all. Like, he does not work with virtual space. And he started talking about something that it has stayed with me forever. It's like, he was talking about buildings that are built out of stone, that like you perceive this massiveness and so on. And then he said something along the lines of like, what if in the pyramids all that stone is just there for you to appreciate the outer layer of it that is communicating that mass? And that sort of blew my mind of like, wow, we're basically thinking about the same thing, but we are coming from such different ends and leading to such different types of work. So I don't know, I mean, it's kind of conflicting to, or I guess it's going back to the reference, the fact that anything virtual we do is probably, at least for quite a while, okay, maybe we will become virtual natives, but at least for quite a while, it all is going to be anchored in the physical world. So in a way, we're thinking the same way across the two, right? And all the mass that we might be building with in the physical world is still experienced sort of virtually in a way, no? Like, we don't understand the section of a build or like the section of a wall if we weren't able to see it drawn, ideally, or if it falls apart, right? And then ruins becomes this revelation of what things are actually made of. But your experience of it is like the outer millimeter that you are looking at. So, but at the same time, anything you create then virtually without matter will be based on your experience of that matter. So I don't know if I'm answering or yeah, well, you can.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, a point that's, I mean, on this question, obviously related. Like, I think that at the heart, we are, like, apart from what the work looks like, we're really, really interested in efficiency, like in the way that architecture or surfaces can do the maximal thing that they could possibly do. Like, that's part of the reason why we're so fascinated by pre-digital virtual spaces, like paintings, tapestries, frescoes, because they had to be really efficient. You couldn't redo them every year, right? If you do a tapestry, like the tapestry of Jason and the Golden Fleece, it covers an entire chapter. All of the different events needs to be woven into this one very expensive thing and be done very, very well, so they will last generations. And I think that's something we're really interested in, the kind of, and that I think will never stop. Like, our interest in compressing in efficient ways a lot of information, a lot of stories into something manageable and something that is. So I think that's a lot of the work we do reflects that interest. Like the Venn room, for instance, the physical exhibition, we were very, very proud that it's the entire exhibition is just made up of fabrics, weighs in kilos, I don't know, in pounds, 2.5 kilos altogether, the entire exhibition. And we really like that kind of effort of like, it's really virtual and it doesn't exist on any server, so it doesn't spin and cost lots of energy somewhere else. But having said that, connected to what Lara said earlier, the bodily interaction is something that like maybe something that we explored the least and something we're super curious of, like literally the human body in space with all of the microns of touch and interaction, breathing the air, etc. And I think that's part of the interest of this kind of wanting to marry the space of the body and the space of the virtual by creating it from scratch in a sort of virtual fashion, even if the physical body would then be in that space. So yeah, I don't know if that's the sort of, if that's the Baroque way of doing it or the complete other way around.
And then the notion of heuristics that comes with anything that is physically built. No? That a brick wall is not just the brick wall, but it's also the idea of the energy and effort that went into building that brick wall. And how long it's going to take us to have that notion of value associated to virtual constructions is still quite a while. No? So, yeah.
That's a great answer. It opened up a whole nother question, but that's, but yeah, thank you.
So I have sort of a bit of a paradox kind of going on in my head about portals, and your mentioning of sort of the histories on them being sort of oftentimes exclusive. And I guess I'm kind of thinking too about access to these kind of virtual worlds being equally sort of exclusive. And I guess I don't totally have a question, but more of just kind of wondering about maybe your optimism for, I don't know, I guess reducing these kind of exclusivities in the virtual spaces or access to them.
It's very, very, very good question. I think ideally history repeats itself in the best possible scenario, because clearly all of this stuff is being developed by revenue-driven companies whose interests are clearly in conflict with what we at least think is the sort of serving humanity at its best. And if history repeats itself, we might see this commercial period be quite short. Like if we look back at the postal service or the telegraph or the telephone that eventually gets pulled in historically by strong governments and becomes a kind of public utility. And we think that that's possible. Ideally, I mean, we can't really see a different model where like one of these big companies win and by the sort of goodness of their heart, they give it to everyone. I don't think that's going to happen. But we are hopeful because we also think that we're just seeing the beginning of the shock of what this media will do generally to people. I mean, if you listen to it's kind of extremist views, but it's said like Ben Vickers in London has spoken about the possibility of what he called then at least a VR winter, like what we saw with the introduction of psychedelics. Like literally it's too shocking for the world that just let's ban it all until we figure this stuff out. So it might be so shocking that somehow strong governments step in and say like, no, either we're shutting it down or you let us manage this and do it slowly. And we don't have a different model actually to kind of base it on. And we think that, but we are hopeful that that might happen. There's going to be maybe 20, 30 years or so of a lot of confusion when like enormous companies or even individuals had a lot of things or money or culture and life invested in certain things that then needs to be uprooted and changed, etc. But part of the reason why we're doing the study of portals, this is just a small part of this enormous challenge that we are facing. But we're kind of saying like if we're going to base it on what we know, which is the portals we experience in fiction, we need to know which ones maybe we shouldn't look at for design inspiration, and maybe which ones would be more helpful to push forward as for these big companies that are inevitably going to actually build them for real. But we are hopeful, but it's going to be really, we're going to see so many shocking things in the next 20 years. We have to be ready for bumpy ride. Yeah.
I had a question about the way bodies relate to virtual space. I remember that in one of the slides there was an animation of an exhibition where the participant is kind of touching the exhibition. And I'm wondering if there's maybe other more direct ways for the body itself to relate to the virtual space without the mediation of a physical object, or do you see the physical as kind of a necessary component in that?
I mean, you always, if you're in a virtual space, you're still going to bump into this wall here if it's not reflected in the virtual space in which you are at, right? So one thing that we think is very obvious and that is just not happening so much with virtual space is that you really need to consider what the physical context in which you are actually is. Where are those barriers and so on. So that is a very direct issue. That is like you don't just go somewhere else. You have a body under gravity that is stepping on things. And then we have seen also a lot of issues emerging from that, where if you create a cognitive conflict in between movement in the virtual realm and your body is not moving, then we don't deal very well with that as humans, right? So we think it's more like having that coherence in between the two. Now, I think this prompts also the possibility to reflect on something very interesting, which is like, how does the body actually now relate to, or like how does the body experience physical architecture? Because we don't often go around like stroking walls and, right? I mean, so, and then, yeah, you are seated on furniture, but that is furniture, right? What are enclosures doing? And, well, they're providing a degree of shelter, they're changing temperature and so on. But then there are many other things that are being sensed through a mixture of inputs, right? And many of which are probably also cultural associations and so on. So that being said, there are very interesting experiments on the body's relationship, or like the role of the body in virtual space. Like I always bring up one of my favorite games, which is Super Hot, where you are through the speed at which you move, you control the speed at which the world runs. And I think that starts to talk about something that to me is actually maybe the one very new thing that I've experienced, and thanks to virtual reality, which is embodying the passing of time. However, it's an experience that very much looks into yourself. There is, or like a world that you can only experience individually. There is a lot of devices coming up in terms of haptics and so on, but I think probably one of the most interesting things is how you experience the way something feels just by seeing it and building expectations on that. So entering a world that is built out of a very rough material or a very soft material has a certain degree of implications in where your head is at when you are in that space, even if you know that it's virtual, but it's still connecting to that. So I think a lot of our experience of physical architecture is already built upon these previous experiences and not necessarily the direct contact at that very moment. And I think that is something that applies 100% to the experience of virtual space, which is expectations based on memories of what we know certain things feel like, and often like using or like talking to those expectations or breaking them or creating paradoxes. I think is a very powerful design tool when creating virtual space.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. It was really interesting. I'm kind of really interested in the virtual spaces, like which is introduced in here. It's kind of like, in some sense, I could regard it as kind of a new universal space. So it's kind of like there's really flattened, and there's no, I'm not really sure, but there's no power balance. There's no politics in there, but I'm just kind of really interested in how that, for example, like our like cultural identities could be like embedded in here, but after that, I think there will be a certain kind of politics, power balance will be happening. Yeah, and I'm kind of really interested in that those like things, what kind of like dynamics will be happening there, and would it be like visualized at there? Because I think, like, especially in VR world, I think it's strongly relying on the visual features. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a little bit messed up, but yeah.
Maybe we misunderstand here, but if I understand you correctly, I would argue actually that from one perspective, virtual spaces are even more politically embedded than physical ones, because they cannot exist. You know, like a lamp in a virtual space uses real electricity to run. It needs to be stored somewhere. It's like Jaron Lanier said that the digital realm is the only space that is completely our responsibility. Like, it's running based on an insanely complex network of things that needs to work. at the same time, where there is no necessarily like that neighbor there or this neighborhood. It's incredibly complexly interwoven with a gazillion things that all needs to work at the same time, that all have their own political, cultural kind of implications. So I think actually it's kind of an illusion that I think actually many of these tech companies kind of strive on. You know, they don't want to show the server farms and where they are. They don't want to show the energy that it consumes, and they don't want to necessarily show the people that they exclude by either the cost of the hardware or by the sort of onboarding of the complexity of getting into them, or indeed, something we didn't speak about today, but all of these platforms has usually a very, very complex surveillance system that's constantly surveilling you to make sure that you don't break the rules of the place. And this is an endless debate where in a way it's like it's much more heavily surveilled than the physical world. We don't use Mozilla Hub specifically for the surveillance part, but because it's run by a non-profit, there's no data stored by anyone apart from the creator. In contrast to Meta's Horizon worlds, where every single thing that happens is constantly stored in the minute bit of pixel. And it's stored so long that if you are in a situation where you as an individual want to report something, then you say, I want to report this, then everything that happened half an hour previously is now recorded as a kind of spatial environment. I mean, I can't imagine any more political space than that, right? So I think it's a really interesting question, because I think a lot of these things are, I mean, coming back to the question that we heard earlier about being hopeful or not, like there are really good forces out there to make this possible, and at every single tech conference there is a corner of very loud people that have very, very good arguments for how to solve these things and how to make them more visible, etc. So maybe I misunderstood, but I thought it was a good way to run with with this way of looking at your question. Yeah.
Lara and Fredrik, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. Really appreciate it. I think I speak on behalf of several in thanking you. And special thanks for having this event on our unofficial first day back to campus. I think this made it really special, so huge thanks.